Hi, I'm Colin from Grazing, and 5 weeks ago we came on this site with about 9 goats. We let them in on this site that was heavily infested with weeds, really choked up with all sorts of things that were problematic. It's time to come back and have a look and see how they've gone, see how the goats are and how the weeds are going. So often when we come onto a site, we assess not only the site and the vegetation and what the goats are doing, but we assess the animals as well. And what they'll do is they'll actually start to tell me when it's time to move on. They'll follow me around everywhere, they'll talk to me, they'll start to make noise, and we can gather that, hey, it's time to move them on to another site with fresh vegetation. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to regenerate the site, and part of that process is we reduce the biomass. We do it a little bit more slowly than doing it quickly. We don't smash the joint, but we get the goats to graze out what they like, what they pick and choose. We bring the site down, we open it up, and that way we change it more gradually and more beneficial for everybody, the environment, the birds, the insects. The site changes not because we've smashed it, but because we've gradually grazed it over a number of weeks. So the first thing that started to disappear on this site were the blackberries. This shopping trolley was exposed because the blackberries were eaten down. Not only the blackberries, but there's honeysuckle all through this. That's another big problematic plant. So we find as the goats graze through, we find things like shopping trolleys, rocks, lumps of concrete, all sorts of things that make management of this site really difficult. And the goats expose them really, really well. In our first video, which you can see after this video, we showed the ginger, and the ginger was quite dominant on this site. So the ginger though is not as palatable as some of the other weeds that you can see around me now. So the blackberries the goats love, honeysuckle and some of the other problematic vegetation here is really palatable. But they're starting to get into the ginger now. They're starting to have a look at it. They've eaten around some of the edges. They're starting to get into it. They're starting to open it up, step through it, and we're starting to see the results on the ginger that we're looking for. So we're pretty happy with the progress they're making so far. And remember, it's only 5 weeks into this site. Our aim is not to remove all weeds on the first grazing. What we want to do is we want to change the site gradually. We want to give the environment an opportunity to realise that there is change happening. The insects get to move on, the birds get to understand what's happening, and the site changes more gradually, more sympathetically to the environment. So observing our goats gives us the chance to do this. And if you look at this fellow down here, he's also eating dry vegetation. And that's not insignificant, because dry vegetation is obviously fuel load, it's problematic. So turning that dry vegetation into droppings, putting it back into the environment as something that the environment can benefit from and use is a real plus. And the thing about chemicals is they don't give you that. And unlike using chemicals, I don't need any PPE to manage this animal on site. But you do need good fencing. In this particular situation, we've got a permanent fence. It was covered in vegetation and we couldn't really see it. And that vegetation could have meant the goats could have used that vegetation to climb out over the fence. We also couldn't see if there was a hole in the fence, so we couldn't see the state of the fence. We just knew it was there but covered with debris. So in this case we put a temporary fence behind it, and that gives us security. You must have good fencing with goats. Doesn't have to be too elaborate, but it must be good. So consider temporary fencing if you can't see what your fence is like. It's not hard to keep goats in. So what have I just done? I've just chopped down a tree. What's the tree? It's a pittosporum. Pittosporums are really significant weeds in many, many areas, and it's a very problematic plant. So you can see here all this lower growth, the goats were able to access that and strip it back, but they couldn't access the top. So we fell the tree. Normally you would cut and paint a tree like this. We don't, we just fell it. And any of the resprouting that's going to happen on this stump, the goats will pick off. And within a relatively short period of time, this whole tree will die without chemical, just by felling it, letting the goats eat the top, letting the goats eat the regrowth, and the plant is dealt with. And any germinating seedlings of this Pittosporum under the tree, they'll pick off. So as you can see here, these goats are preferencing a really problematic plant, a weed, an invasive weed, and there are other plants on this site that are in ditch that should be here, and they're virtually hardly touched. Here's an example of that. It's a native fern, grows in this wet gully, and so the goats, they've eaten all this stuff in the foreground here, the Pittosporum, a lot of the honeysuckle that was on the ground, a lot of the problematic vegetation, willows. They're just starting on the ginger, but this guy they've left. And I get really excited when I see things like that. And one of the trees they have really stripped back hard is this willow here. So this willow, an old willow, it had fallen down. All of this regrowth was sprouting from these fallen branches, which is what willows do. And they've absolutely climbed all over it and stripped it back, and they will kill this willow, again, without any chemical, just stripping it back, and the tree will die. So ginger on this site, you can see this ginger here has been nibbled at quite a bit. So they're impacting on the ginger, but in amongst, right in the middle of this ginger, is a plant called Carex suppressor. Carex suppressor is a sedge, should be right through here, through this wet gully. This has not been touched, and yet the ginger's been nibbled at. So this is the sort of thing we're talking about. You can use goats to significantly impact on problematic vegetation, introduced exotic invasive vegetation, and often have native species like this untouched or only just lightly nibbled at. That's the result we want. Fire prevention is such a big thing. 5 weeks ago when we brought the goats here, you couldn't walk through this track. This was impenetrable with blackberries and all sorts of other vegetation. Now it's all open. Once this ginger's been nibbled down, you'll have complete access to the whole site. I'm really keen to show you, we talked about poplars. I'm really keen to show you what the poplars were like. So come and follow me and I'll show you exactly what that was like. So while the track is clear, we're starting to clear out some of this other vegetation, and poplars was a significant one. I just mentioned that. We could not see through this area here previously, 5 weeks ago. It was poplars from foliage from the ground right to the top, 6-7 foot high. We had blackberries all through it. Now we can see right through it. They've gone through the whole area. They've opened it up. They've squashed a lot of the blackberries. They're starting to ring bark some of the poplars. And so we now have much clearer access, and the fuel load's been dramatically reduced, and we're going to start to see grass start to grow on the ground again. We're going to see native species coming up in there. This is a great result, and one that I'm really happy with. So the goats have worked pretty heavily in this area. They grazed a lot of the cocksfoot, which is a tall invasive grass, right through this area. They've squashed it down, eaten a lot of it off, eaten all the seeds off. But this is a juncus, and you can see untouched, growing here perfectly okay, and setting seed. The seed will spread through the site, so we're getting good regen just even in this really rudimentary early stage. So goats eating seeds of problematic plants is a good thing because they're a ruminant. Most of the seeds are killed off in the digestive system of the goat. So if you've got blackberry seeds or other seeds that you're worried about being spread by an animal, in the case of a goat, virtually every seed is killed in the gut of that goat. So we've got a situation here with a large tree that's covered in ivy, and the ivy was all down through here, so you couldn't actually see the trunk, but importantly you couldn't see the stems of the ivy either. So now that the goats have stripped all the foliage of the ivy off these stems, we can not only see the tree trunk, but we can cut these with a saw, a chainsaw, a pair of secateurs, anything, tomahawk, doesn't matter. As long as we cut these stems, everything up there in that ivy will die. Why is that important? Because if this was a eucalypt, this ivy would kill this eucalypt. If it was a big old blackwood, it would kill the blackwood. So now we can control this ivy without using any herbicide. We can kill a huge plant on this very large tree without using anything other than a goat and a saw. So in amongst all these trees, we've got an old fallen tree. As I said, ivy will kill trees. It's killed this tree, it's died, and it's fallen over. And now, because it's on the ground, the goats have complete access to all of that ivy, and you can see they've stripped all of that ivy off that dead log, and they've done a terrific job opening it up, clearing it out, eating all of that ivy seed that's produced, that produces so many plants on sites like this. Significantly, we've got hemlock on this site. Now, hemlock is a really nasty plant, very poisonous to stock, very poisonous to people if you ingest the fumes, if you brush cut it, because the fumes of just the sap can become an aerosol. You can get very sick from that. So it's problematic in a whole lot of sites, can be in pasture, but in this particular case, goats can eat hemlock without any ill effect. It's quite incredible really that they can do that, but they can happily eat it. And you can see here, we've stripped a lot of it back. Some of it was mature enough to produce seed, but they'll eat it if they've got other things to eat as well, and they'll do a very good job on it. The most acceptable environmental and healthy way to get rid of hemlock. Really nasty plant, tree tobacco, horrible, smelly, yuck, quite invasive. This guy's been absolutely smashed. The foliage, the flowers, the seed, and there's even a bit of ringbark happening on this plant. So this is a good way to control another problem plant. Young spear thistle here, you can see the top's been eaten off, so that one's going to be smashed. Drain sedge, another really problem plant, allelopathic, produces herbicide. Seeds all been eaten off, no foliage on this plant, they'll continue to graze it, it's been smashed. We've been trying to find wandering trad on this site. We know it's here, but it's been hard to find. And finally we've actually got it, and you can see here there's been a lot of damage to the trad, a lot of it's been eaten off, a lot of it's been broken. And at this time of the year, what goats will do is they'll eat the dry, dead leaves or the dying leaves, so they'll totally clean it up. So again, this is great. This will be replaced by grass. Finally, this is our comparison site. If you remember on the first video, we had this area here which had been brush cut, a lot of debris on the ground. It's been brush cut again, might have even been brush cut a couple of times, and we can see the comparison in the two sites. And while the goats haven't hammered the ginger yet, what we're starting to see here is all that debris is still on the ground, but we're starting to see some weeds coming up through that debris. We'll go down, we'll have a look at what's coming up. So on the outskirts of this site, let's have a look at what's coming up. We've certainly got things like Yorkshire fog, buttercup or ranunculus, which is allelopathic. We've got nightshade coming up. We've got blackberries, we've got drain sedge, all these problematic weeds. We've got bulbs coming up as well. So all of this stuff is now coming up. Even though it's been brush cut, we're almost doing them a favour. So this is the area that's been brush cut, and we've got all of this debris on the ground after it's been brush cut. And all that's doing is really assisting the weeds. Now we've got things like inkweed coming up here, which is a really problematic weed. We've got blackberries, we've got all sorts of things popping up through this vegetation, which is going to hinder the proper things we want. It won't hinder the ginger, and it won't hinder the other weeds. So we've just contributed to the problem persisting. So one of the key differences here with well-managed goats on sites like this is they turn all of this problematic vegetation into fertiliser. Fertiliser that's great in the soil, feeds not only other plants, indigenous plants, but it feeds the microbes in the soil, the worms, all the other things, and all that carbon is transferred into droppings, which goes back into the soil. We all win. We'll come back to this site in a couple of months. We'll let the goats do their thing. Don't miss coming back to this site when we do. Make sure you subscribe and make sure you share this video with people that have got this sort of problematic vegetation and they want to deal with it without chemicals in an environmental way that really can work so well.